Welcome to the 12-2 podcast, folks.
Yeah, and we need any help we can get with our voices, right?
I guess so.
So how have you been?
Been good. How about yourself?
Well, good, but
I'm very busy right now.
That's what I was going to say. Why don't you just get to know Kevin a little bit better, right?
Yeah.
Tell our listeners what you do.
I do for
why you're so busy right now.
Well, I'm a real estate appraiser.
Yeah.
So I either.
Well, you run a real estate appraisal company as well.
Well,
so
yeah,
therefore,
but I appraise single family homes mainly.
Yeah.
And if you know, mortgage rates dropped a little bit, and they had a 30% increase in mortgage applications last month, which then means that hits us now, and so we can tell that the economy is turning a little bit.
But you knew that, right? Because you tracked this 30% increase. You knew.
I just feel it. I can tell with the volume.
Right.
So, all of a sudden, it just went crazy, and the girls in the office were like, "We don't know how we're going to get you everywhere you got to be." So, I mean, in our company, we do quite a wide area. I'll go places that a lot of appraisers won't go. I'll do properties that a lot of appraisers won't touch.
Yeah.
I just like the challenge.
Good. Yeah, that sounds like you.
But yeah, that's what I do for in my real life. I guess.
Your real life, yeah. That's what you
pays
do.
The bills.
Yeah, so you can have fun with stuff like this, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But that's a good lead-in, I think, to what we want to talk about today. So, what do you attribute that 30% increase to? Let's dive into that a little bit, because there's more than is there something more to it than just a drop in the interest rates, which were not that significant.
No, it wasn't that significant. A lot of it, and I can tell you that if we want to do a little bit of a history, in 2008, of course, I'd been in the industry. I got in it started appraising about 2002, I think.
Okay.
It all kind of blurs. 2001, 2002. And that was during the period of no doc loans, and they would loan on 125%. So a person could walk into any mortgage guy and go, "Hey, I make X amount," and they didn't check it, and they gave them a mortgage. And of course, that ended up with 2008, the crash. I know most people.
Well, you had the bundling, didn't you? You had the bundling of mortgages
and then there was
being sold as securities and that kind of thing.
They've always done that.
Investments.
Yeah,
has that always been done?
Well, they've always bundled appraisals. Bundled mortgages, and then typically sold them to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which is a government-backed entity, and that guaranteed the mortgages.
Yeah.
So what they began to
guaranteed the mortgages.
Basically, it was the taxpayer that was going to guarantee the mortgage.
Right.
But what they did off of that was then they started the derivatives, because this was it didn't matter because it was guaranteed by the federal government. And so if it failed, everybody was going to get their money, supposedly. So they started doing these derivatives, and then they started doing derivatives of the derivatives, and then somebody stubbed their toe along the way, and and basically people started not paying their mortgages because they got overextended, and that started a trickle down effect.
Yeah, and the derivative thing, it really you got a mortgage, which when our parents were doing this, right, and even when you and I got my first mortgage when I was in 1983, right?
Okay.
And you're talking about 2002 leading up to the 2008 debacle, right? And as the derivatives became more and more of a thing, the speculative nature of mortgages, really to the average person, you and I, for example, at that point, had no idea the direction that mortgages were taking, that the mortgages themselves were actually becoming significant instruments of speculation, right?
Exactly.
In the markets,
right?
And which drove the risk, as you said. People then who had overextended, had been given mortgages that they should not have been given based upon their standard of their earning ability.
But what had happened was the federal government had come to the major banks and mortgage companies and said, you have to lend X amount of your paper has to be on B paper, which means that you have to lend to people who have proven that they can't pay their bills. And that was to create fairness
in the terms of home ownership
and home ownership.
When
right.
everybody, the whole idea was, and this is so Marxist, right? everybody needs to own a home for the most part. Now that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but that's kind of the philosophy behind it all.
That was the philosophy then. Yeah. That we need to get more people in homes, and so what they ended up doing was they ended up saying that you then have to lend money to people who have proven that they can't pay the money back, which of course after a few years later caused them to start foreclosing on that, which started this whole place, which I mean, and I could tell it in my business. We were going along fine. We were doing at the time we were doing about 200 appraisals and
200 appraisals a month. Okay.
Right. In our firm. And all of a sudden it went from 200 down to 30. And then it went to 30 again, and we couldn't sustain. And so we laid office staff off, and we as appraisers started looking around going, I wonder if UPS is hiring. And about the time you got really desperate, all of a sudden we started getting orders again, so much that I brought my staff back on. And basically the foreclosures hit. And then we spent the next 4 years basically doing foreclosures. And that was the busiest I've ever been, was doing foreclosures.
Wow.
And people walked, and here was the thing. If you got a mortgage for 120, or you got a loan for 125% of the house, well, you didn't have that much into the house if you walked away from it, and people just walked away. And they just we'd go into houses and just all the stuff would be there. I mean, they literally just walked out
left
the door.
Everything, right?
Yeah. It was wild. And what was interesting was, of course, Obama was in the White House at that time. And he was there for 8 years. And what they did was they artificially pushed the rates down, the interest rates down. They held them down to create this, I guess, hoping that people would continue to buy.
But even that, wasn't that a little bit of smoke and mirrors in order to try to manipulate people into buying? Right.
Yeah. Right.
In order to, but the economy, but the structure was not there. There was a total void in the structure.
Right. And basically, and because people didn't feel secure, that mortgage, property rates just stayed flat. And they stayed flat for 8 years.
Wow.
It was wild. I mean, it was just flat. And there were people coming in, of course, and buying these foreclosures. And I will tell you that if the banks had taken all their foreclosures and dumped them on the market at one time, it would have collapsed the market, the housing market, completely in this country.
Really?
But they would trickle them out so that they could maintain, so they wouldn't destroy neighborhoods, basically, even though some neighborhoods were destroyed. Somebody went in and bought a house for $300,000, and next thing you know, 25% of the houses are foreclosed on, and then they're selling it at foreclosed rates. So all of a sudden, they they have a house that they owe $300,000 on, and it's only worth like $150,000.
Right.
So what do you do then?
Right.
And then a lot of people. Then that created this thing of, well, why am I going to make my payments? I'll just walk away. And so that just continued the thing. So for 8 years, property values stayed the same. It was just kind of, you could just feel this malaise that was there. And I will tell you, the moment that Trump got elected the first time, you could feel it. All of a sudden, within months of his first election, the housing market took off and went crazy. And that's when we saw these 22%, year over year increases. And then when COVID hit, it just continued going. Especially in this area, because you had all of a sudden everybody said, well, you can go home and work from home. So people who were living in California and New York and Pennsylvania and these high, Massachusetts, all of a sudden said, we're going to move to places where
North Carolina,
where the taxes are low. And so they flooded into here. And so, we saw these massive jumps. And
which is one of the reasons during that time we saw a massive increase in our church family from folks moving into the area.
Right.
Of course, you and I were talking too. You had talked about the forecasts. We had talked about the forecast way back then of people moving here, right? Because of the low taxes, the great business climate, et cetera. And we saw that. We saw people coming to our church and from everywhere.
Right.
And
And so what you saw, and then of course Trump gets out of office, and you see Biden come in, and again, They artificially kept the rates down as long as they could. And then all of a sudden it was unsustainable. And so rates, of course, mortgage rates went back or went up probably to where they should have been.
And it didn't take long.
No. It went up pretty quick. And so you saw this kind of leveling off. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is as that progressed, you saw less and less people being able to buy houses because you had people who had these mortgage rates at 2% and 3%, who weren't going to sell their house. No. Why am I going to sell my house and then go buy
one of those
smaller house?
Yeah, exactly.
And then my payment's going to be more than what I have now.
Yeah.
And so what you had was this dearth or there's a natural order of things within housing. You know, if you notice people get married, they go buy their first house, which is usually a small house.
Yeah.
Then they have a couple kids and okay, so now and of course, you know, they've worked now for 5-10 years, so they've probably they're making more money.
Yeah.
So then they move to the bigger house that for the kids. And what was happening was people weren't moving out of the bigger houses.
Yeah.
And so you had this kind of log jam with the starter homes. And so you saw people who normally would be moving into the house, getting their first house.
Nowhere. Well, they had nowhere to go.
They
right?
can't
because
they can't afford.
Yeah.
Because there's so few houses and so much money chasing fewer houses, which of course increases the price. And of course, you know, a divorce happens and you normally sell the house. Grandma dies, you normally sell the house.
Right.
But that stuff wasn't happening because even on this time, even if you lost your job, well, now all of a sudden you had so much equity in this house.
Right.
I'm not going to let it go.
Yeah.
And so they held on to it. So what we have seen though is just bad business practices, bad government practices, kind of made people unsure of what the next thing, what if they were going to keep their job.
Right.
And housing follows jobs.
Yeah, sure.
If you are secure in the fact that you're going to have your job tomorrow and you feel like you're going to start making more money, you are more apt to buy a property.
Absolutely.
Or you're more apt to upgrade the property, sell your house and move to a bigger house. It's just the way it is. And I will tell you that probably what's driving it more than, yes, the mortgage rates drop. And so psychologically people go, oh, I should go buy a house now.
Yeah.
But also I think it also has to do with the fact that I think there's some confidence there that in the political climate that they are going to be driving jobs into this country. And if people feel like they're going to have their job, they're more likely to buy a house.
Yeah, and I think the jobs outlook's got to be really, you know, as we see so many foreign countries, you know, making countries themselves, but the industry in those countries making investments here, the job market is, we're going to be to the place where, you know, we may not have enough people to staff all the jobs, right? And a lot of people, and you're hearing a lot of liberals these days. Well, who's gonna pick our fruit? Who's gonna do, you know? And a lot of that stuff.
Which was amazing. That Crockett, she said, we're not gonna. She wants.
Lord of mercy.
If you follow out her logic, because she just said the other day, we're done picking cotton, so we need to have these illegal aliens in. So what she is advocating for is basically a slave class of people who get paid below what the market is paying because they don't have a choice. They can't. But she wants that. That is what she is advocating as a Democratic representative.
And I think, Kevin, that's what they're thinking. She was just dumb enough to say it out loud.
Right.
And the other thing that we're seeing today, even with the tariffs, right, that we see now, and we'll maybe get back to the housing thing, because that's pretty fascinating what you're telling us, okay? But even today with the tariffs, where we're trying to just reciprocate, right? That's the key word. It's reciprocate. You know, why should we pay, you know, 30% tariffs when we're levying only 10% on someone, right?
4%.
4%.
I think in China, I think it was 4%.
Was it really?
I think it was either 2 or 4% because they're most favored nation status. They're part of the WTO. You see, all this starts back, you know, after the World Wars.
Sure.
You know, and you know, the people in power, the elite, if we want to say, they come together and go, we need to stop having these wars. And the way we need to do that, if we're all interdependent on each other, we won't fight each other.
And a lot of this was, to be just to be honest, a lot of it, the cover for this was helping countries recover after the wars.
Right.
So the underlying motivation that you're talking about there was covered by the somewhat noble idea of let's help these countries rebuild.
Right.
And using tariffs as a means to help do that from an economic perspective.
Yeah, and this is where you have the Open Society come into play, and then the guy who wrote that book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, I think his name is Karl Popper, I think is his name. He's the one that George Soros learned under.
Okay.
And that's why he does what he does.
Yeah.
He wants basically nationalism to go away. He thinks that borders are an obstacle to this open society. And basically, you've heard about the World Economic Foundation with, what is his name, Klaus or whatever his name is. Who's getting ready to step down.
Yeah, resigned,
They basically wanted, hey, we'll be the elites. You've heard of Davos, where all these rich people and the people with power all fly in. And basically they're sitting there going, how can we control the world and make the world beneficial for us? And the plebes, the rest of us common people, will just give them enough to live on. Because they have this thing called, what is it, Project 2030, where they've even done the ad, and you've probably seen it on social media, where you're not going to own anything and you'll be happy.
Yeah, and AI is going to be a big part of that, driving that. And that whole thing you're talking about, that open society, is really nothing more than macro Marxism for the most part.
Right.
It's taking the idea of making a country into a Marxist model, right? And rather, with the open society, the open borders, doing it worldwide. And you got ultimately the New World Order. But let me just real quick, I want to close one thing, because this is fascinating. I want to get back ultimately, if we can, to the housing market education you're giving us. But the point of the matter is that when we are forcing ourselves through uneven trading protocols, right? We're on the short end of the stick with tariffs, for example. We know that China has sweatshops, right? They practice slave labor in the guts of the country in places, right? And so we've been doing this forever, right? We have been supporting that by buying the cheap goods so that we can buy our whatever at a cheaper price.
Get our $50 flat screen TV.
We get our $50 flat screen TV, right? And it's being produced. And so what we've done is we say that we are a country that is opposed to slavery. The left would say, oh, slavery, da-da-da. It's the Republicans. It's the right, da-da-da. When in fact, they're the ones who have set up, for the most part, and some exceptions, right? But a system where we are at a trade deficit to countries like that, and so therefore we are supporting offshore. In other words, we ran our manufacturing jobs offshore, but we also help create slavery offshore.
Exactly.
And with that, and so it's like, because it's over there,
we don't see it.
And so therefore, out of sight, out of mind, it's not there. And so I really want our listeners, people in Integrity Church and beyond, to really understand the macro view of this, right? This is much more than somebody saying, well, tariffs are not good. Reciprocal tariffs are simply saying we will tariff each other at the same rate. Correct. For the most part. And that's the idea of leveling the playing field. But in our press, which, as we know, anything that the current administration does is going to be, they're going to go the opposite way, right? And we don't necessarily hear that, right? No. Now go back to the housing thing for a minute. So you made a point a few minutes ago. I thought that was pretty interesting. You said that I think you made reference to the point when the transition from Obama to Trump, and you began to see the optimism and folks applying for mortgages, buying homes, et cetera. Correct. You also said something about the mortgage rates, and I want to clarify what you said, okay? You mentioned that once again, the mortgage rates became artificially deflated. Now, and you had already said that was under the Obama administration, right? and we saw the rising of the rates. I guess once we transitioned from Trump to Biden,
right, and coming out of COVID,
So during that time frame, that 4 years of the first Trump administration, do you think that the interest rates were artificially deflated?
They probably were. They probably were
not deflated, but suppressed. Yeah,
but it was driven by the fact that the Federal Reserve was pushing down the inner rate between banks, as we know, and mortgage rates are sort of tied to that.
They are.
I mean, they fluctuate with that as those rates go up.
Sure.
Mortgage rates, of course, tend to go up also. They don't follow exactly, but they do.
Consumer debt is more responsive, I think, to that at a different scale. But the response, I think, the elasticity of it is more significant.
But what you had was the Fed, keeping those interest rates down in order to drive, basically, to give free money to hedge funds, Wall Street, so that they could continue. And you also saw this dramatic rise in the stock market because these people had this free money, that they weren't having to pay interest on, basically, and so they were dumping it in the stock market. So I think it was this push to almost give an idea that the economy was doing better than what it really was.
Yeah,
and they tried to push it as long as they could. But I think COVID kind of came in and kind of messed that up, and eventually you had all that money dump in from COVID,
right?
Where they were the quantitative easing,
print,
the giving people $600. That's just a lot of money that got into the system, and so now they had to take that out. And the easiest way for the Fed to control that is, of course, to raise interest rates, because then it takes more money to pay that money back, and it strips the money out of the circulation, basically.
Right. Yeah. And that's and in a lot of countries. Well, first of all, that whole dynamic was causing those, you mentioned the hedge fund managers, the folks who are already, for the most part, the Wall Streeters were the ones that were benefiting, not the folks, not the average person at all. So it's almost like the political parties, and I'm thinking about the Democrats in particular, kind of playing this mantra of being for the man on the street, the woman on the street, when in reality the policies that they were undertaking, they were benefiting the rich already. Right. And it's funny how that side tends to accuse what we might refer to as the right. Now, not everything's going great with the right, but we've already talked about the fact that conservatism is more aligned with biblical principles. We know that, right? You can't deny that, right? But trying to make the argument that it is really the right who is for the big rich person, et cetera, accusing them of the same things that they are doing in their policies, which just speaks to the power of groupthink and the power of the loudest voice in the room.
Right.
And that's the controlling of the media, which has been a progressive, no pun intended, a progressive thing over the last, 100 years or so, right? The who controls the narrative is an incredibly important thing,
right,
that we're talking about.
You can see the evolution of the Democratic Party. I mean, that when they were
evolution in my mind.
Yeah, exactly. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s, they were quote unquote for labor.
Yeah,
and
that was true.
Right. I mean, for the average, they said that they represented Main Street, and the Republicans represented Wall Street, and a lot of that was kind of leftover from the turn of the 19th century, where Calvin Coolidge comes in and says the business of America is business. And basically he said, if we can make it to where business can succeed, that helps the average person.
Sure.
You saw with Reagan, in his economic policy, hey, if we cut the rate, if we cut the rates, businesses will be able to invest more and they'll be able to hire people. And if you have a job, you have freedom.
And tax revenues increase, but not at the expense of the taxpayer.
Exactly.
Because it comes out of a higher level of income, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, but somewhere along after Bill Clinton, it flipped. And you see this change where the Democratic Party becomes beholden to these multinational corporations and to Wall Street and the hedge funds, and they basically gear everything that way. And that comes back to this whole tariff thing. They were willing to sell the average American manufacturer, blue collar worker out for cheap stuff coming into the country so that these corporations could increase their profits, and it destroyed Main Street. There are cities and places that have been completely hollowed out by the exit of manufacturing jobs. I mean, we've lost 4.4 million, and they estimate, in the last 20 years.
Right?
4.4 million people have lost their jobs who were in the manufacturing sector.
Yeah, like 900,000 factories, hundreds of thousands of factories. 7 to 9,000 factories. Yeah, 100,000. Yeah,
gone, and they basically 2 to 3.5 million of that they estimate is directly related to when China became part of the World Trade Organization, which was in early 2000. I think it was in 2000. So in 25 years, we saw, factories move across. And so basically what we did was we traded cheap goods for people with good losing their good jobs. So
the North American Free Trade Agreement, right, was the treaty that really greased the skids for this back in the 90s. And let's face it, that there were folks on both sides of the aisle
that wanted this.
Who wanted this and global trade, et cetera. And it's one thing to you can't level a field if the level of opportunity is not also, or if the degree of opportunity is not leveled as well. And in order for global free trade to work, there has to be similar restrictions and regulations across the global platform, right?
Yeah.
And everything was different, and we naively expected everything to work when the barriers were different. The tariffs, right? And we created tariffs. We created barriers through the tariffs in order to drive this type of thing, like we're talking about, to benefit the Wall Street folks. Because when the Democrats figured out, right, that there's a lot of money there. That goes back into the coffers to get elected, and stay in power. And so it followed the money.
In the 90s, Nancy Pelosi was calling for high tariffs against China, and now she's completely changed her mind now that she's made millions upon millions off the stock market.
Right. Yeah.
Before we get out of here, just one thing about China, they're playing both sides. They say that they're a developed nation, yet then they claim on the other side that they're a developing nation. And what you have to understand is that with GATT, with the global treaty, tariff treaties and stuff like that, what happens is developing countries get to put tariffs on. And so that's why they're playing both sides. And so that's why they have tariffs against us.
Just like a country coming out of a war, as we talked about earlier.
Right. But we can't have tariffs with them.
Right. Yeah.
And so this conversation is fascinating.
It is.
And
it absolutely is.
And it affects our pocketbook and your neighbor's pocketbook and your neighbor's job so directly.
Yeah, but the whole thing about we got to go, but there's got to be pain, right, in order for there to be gain. We've got to be willing to deal with that, and I don't know that we are in America. I just don't know.
I know we like that. We like that cheap stuff. That cheap crap for
this cheap crap. Yeah, exactly.
We're willing to sacrifice our neighbor's job so that we can get a $5 T-shirt.
And we're seeing a drop in the stock market. Of course, yesterday things came back up. Today, back down a little bit. But that's the stock market. It's always been volatile. And people who don't have anything to do with the stock market are just drinking the Kool-Aid and screaming to high heaven about it. When this is part of what's got to happen in order for us to get well.
Right. We've got to reset.
We got to reset,
anyway.
And we got to go.
Yep.
It was
this
fun.
was quick.
It was quick. Really quick. Yeah.
So anyway, Thanks. Like us, follow us. We appreciate it.
And more on Kevin's analysis of the housing market next time. Take care. Bye-bye.